Why is Apple so stubborn? If you clicked onto this video and have either used an Apple product before, or are even vaguely aware of their existence, which everyone is, you'll probably know what I mean, at least to some extent, and could likely come up with at least a couple examples. Some are incredibly annoying, but maybe somewhat understandable. Apple removed the headphone jack. Why? To sell AirPods. Apple kept using Lightning for years until the EU forced them to switch to USB-C, and why? To control the massive market that is smartphone chargers. Apple has been determined to not allow third-party app stores for as long as they possibly can so they can maximize their own revenue. iMessage is fantastic and will never come to Android because for many people, those blue bubbles are the only reason to buy an iPhone in the first place. We've never had easily user-replaceable batteries or expandable memory because it forces you to go to Apple and ultimately pay more money for a better experience. Apple removed the charging bricks from our phone boxes under the guise of being environmentally friendly, except of course this forces people to actually buy new chargers and has saved Apple a lot of money. Apple has fought the right to repair for years in order to maintain a monopoly over the product repair market. This is nothing new. Apple loves money, and they've been doing a really good job of making it over the years, currently being worth over $3.5 trillion. That is a market cap higher than the GDP of only the world's biggest economic powers. So yeah, hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and while Apple is often stubborn, generally it's because it's profitable, and even if that's annoying to us, the consumer, at least we can logically understand, okay, sure, Apple wants to make money. But then there's those instances of Apple being stubborn seemingly only for the sake of it. Easy example, Apple Magic Mice. These have been around for years, and their charging ports are still, as of making this video, on the bottom of the device, rendering the mouse useless when you want to charge it. Originally, when these came out in 2009, they used two AA batteries, and at least those were easy enough to swap out, but in 2015, it switched to a Lightning port, and then we got this.
The Magic Mouse. Getting the ergonomics well done and was key.
With Magic Mouse?
Yeah.
Okay.
In 2024, Apple finally switched these to USB-C instead of Lightning, which means they had to go and physically redesign this mouse, which means they had a chance to fix things, and they still put the port on the bottom. It's only just now being rumored that we'll see a proper redesign fixing this in the next year or two, which is insane. It's beyond crazy that Apple has now essentially let this stupid, incomprehensible design flaw linger for a decade. Any wireless mouse with USB-C charging plugs in like this so you can use it if it's dead, but not Apple's because they're just too stubborn to fix it. We've also seen instances of just blatant hardware issues that Apple avoids fixing for years, like the butterfly keyboard. You remember those? There have been so many issues with every iteration of that keyboard, which I never minded typing on those, the feel of it, but holy moly, they are so fragile. My own 2018 MacBook Pro I had to get fixed twice, and even now the keyboard still doesn't work right. You often get two characters popping up for a single keystroke. Apple just kept iterating on this design instead of going back to the keyboard that was already pretty great and, actually function properly. Apple loves to be stubborn, but it's not always necessarily a black and white issue. There are some things that are more preference-based and not necessarily geared purely for profit. In fact, sometimes it's actually probably hurting Apple for profit. For example, there are no Macs with touchscreens. They've never had them and potentially never will. macOS is designed to be used with a mouse or a trackpad, and that's it. If you want a touchscreen experience closer to a Mac, you need to get an iPad, and while iPad OS is an okay halfway option, it's just not the same thing. The first Microsoft Surface came out in 2012 alongside the disaster that was Windows 8, but overall the style of touchscreen laptops has been incredibly successful over the years and are frankly just convenient for a lot of users. There are times when it is easier just to tap the screen instead of using a mouse or a trackpad, and in fairness, Apple's trackpads are fantastic and probably better than any Windows laptop out there, but that doesn't mean a touchscreen MacBook Air or something wouldn't be extremely convenient, especially if it had Apple Pencil compatibility and could flip around into a tablet like a Surface. That kind of device would see extreme commercial success and frankly would be the go-to computer for digital artists. And I've seen some rumors that say maybe Apple are working on a touchscreen Mac. Maybe we'll see one in 2025, who knows, but considering Microsoft has been doing them for well over a decade, I think it's very fair to be annoyed that Apple hasn't done it yet. And there's so many instances of Apple not adding basic features that competitors have had for years, like we didn't even get an always-on display until the iPhone 14 Pro, though I guess at least better late than never. And hey, we should give Apple some credit for instances where they finally do give in to demand and backtrack on some of their missteps, even if it takes a while, and mind, they shouldn't always get credit for this, like them finally redesigning the Magic Mouse. Cool, that doesn't change the fact that for 10 years users have had to charge it like this. It's so ridiculous. Or hey, wow, Apple finally added USB-C to iPhone, except it was only because the EU forced them to. Otherwise, I can almost guarantee we'd still be using Lightning. Even so, we can't only be negative. We do have some big changes that have positively impacted consumers. The easiest example for me is how MacBooks have evolved over the past decade. In 2016, we saw a complete redesign that made the MacBook Pro incredibly thin and beautiful and simplistic, but it was terrible for cooling, and debatably even worse, got rid of all the ports in favor of going purely USB-C. The world was not ready for a pure USB-C laptop from Apple. Back in 2019, I was in university and I had a 2018 Touch Bar MacBook Pro that was great. I loved that laptop, except I had to bring around a ridiculous dongle with me everywhere so I could do the simplest things that any other laptop could do out of the box, like use a USB flash drive, or put in an SD card, or most brutally for school, have an HDMI port so I could connect my MacBook to the projector or whatever for presentations. If I ever forgot my dongle, I was screwed, except yeah, a lot of other people had MacBooks too, because I mean, it's college, and there was a good chance I would have been able to borrow a dongle because everybody owned dongles, they needed them. And if you're selling a product where literally everyone needs to buy an adapter, that might be a good indication that it is too early to fully commit to removing every port except for this one universal standard that Apple themselves were even unwilling to commit to. Yeah, there's a real irony that Apple refused to give their iPhones USB-C, which I think they should have either done with the iPhone 7, which came out around the same time as the MacBooks, or with the iPhone 10, because it was a huge redesign. It would have made perfect sense. If you went and bought an iPhone back in the day, the charger you got in the box would not plug into your MacBook. It was crazy. But hey, at least MacBooks still had a headphone jack, right? Well, as annoying as all this was, and as terrible as the overheating issues were, thanks to the build of these things, they were so slim, Apple did eventually fix things and recognize their failure. They got rid of the butterfly keyboard, they got rid of the touch bars, which I never really found to be that annoying, although it was sort of a pain sometimes not to have the function keys, and especially not to have the escape key, have that be digital, that kind of sucked. But aside from that, I could live with it. But Apple just scrapped the whole thing altogether, and along with that, brought back some ports. Modern MacBooks now have HDMI again, they have an SD card slot, they even brought back a MagSafe, and we get the best of both worlds because you can charge via USB-C in any of the available ports or use the MagSafe. It's great. Yeah, there's still no USB-A, which, I mean, sure, sometimes I still need to use a dongle, but in the 2020s, USB-C has become a lot more common, and now that iPhones are finally using it, this sort of setup is becoming less and less inconvenient as each year passes. The physical design of MacBook Pros also got simpler. It's more boxy and more spacious, and in conjunction with Apple's fantastic M series of processors replacing Intel outright, who frankly have been pretty stagnant in terms of innovation for a while, cooling is no longer really an issue, and what we have now, I can comfortably say, is probably the best Apple's laptops have ever been. Yeah, they're still expensive, you're paying the Apple tax, but I truly believe these are the best overall laptops on the market you can buy because they're just so good at basically everything, aside from the things you might want a Windows laptop for, like gaming. Otherwise, the battery life is amazing, the displays are gorgeous and smooth, the notch might look a little goofy, but it immediately blends into the experience and everything just works. And Apple's done a really great job, in my opinion, of fixing their past mistakes here. Again, they deserve credit for it. Then there's the flip side of Apple's stubbornness, where it actually turns out to be a good thing or an ultimate positive for the industry at large. I think that's what they expected the USB-C only fiasco to be, but they never fully committed. Thing is, in the past, we've seen Apple morph the tech landscape time and time again, despite the fact that Macs have never really made up a truly significant portion of the computer market, at least compared to Windows. And we've also seen in more recent times the headphone jack. Every other smartphone manufacturer eventually got rid of it as well, but iPhones do make up a really significant portion of the smartphone market as it is, so it's sort of understandable. But even way back when, some easy examples, floppy disks were absent from the iMac, which that computer was the first really big splash Steve Jobs made when he came back to his own company that had fired him in the 80s. The iMac was so important for many reasons. Being all-in-one, it had very little setup required and was actually easy and uncomplicated, making it perfect for the home at a time where computers were still very much abstract concepts for most people, and also frankly very boring. PCs were were beige or gray boxes that had jumbles of wires and were made for the office. But then this iMac comes along with fun colors and a translucent plastic backing that showed you what was inside. It was transparent both literally and figuratively. It wasn't pretending to be a magic box. It was a computer you could set up and use right away, connect to the internet, and it didn't have a floppy drive because it didn't need one. It had USB and a CD drive because Jobs recognized this was the future. They also did away with serial ports, which, like floppy disks, you probably have never used before thanks to the proliferation of USB. iMac reviews initially were very mixed because critics at the time were annoyed the features weren't there, but the computer saw huge commercial success and basically saved Apple from the brink of bankruptcy, all because Steve Jobs saw what consumers actually needed and trimmed the unnecessary fat and complication, shaping the future of computers in the process. Then skip to 2008 with the MacBook Air, which basically introduced the era of ultrabooks, these laptops that aim to be as slim and as simple as possible after years of laptops being known as purely clunky, heavy devices with poor battery life. But how do you slim down these machines when you need an optical drive for DVDs and CDs? Well, you get rid of the optical drive because maybe you don't actually need it. This was again hugely controversial, but it was the right move because optical drives take up far too much space in a laptop, and eventually the rest of the market would follow suit. Don't forget, this was before streaming Netflix or even YouTube was really that popular. Digital media wasn't so much a thing yet, but Apple saw the direction things were moving and took advantage, and I would argue it's been a net positive for computers as a whole moving forward. These are just a couple examples of Apple and Steve Jobs at the time being stubborn in the face of a lot of controversy and hate, where it would have been so much easier to just give in and keep including floppy drives, or make the MacBook Air just a little thicker to include a DVD slot. Another example, Steve Jobs infamously banned Adobe Flash from iPhones and iPads, calling it inefficient and insecure. This made people furious. It was a really big deal, and it was a legitimate reason to go to an Android competitor, but lo and behold, Steve Jobs was right. Flash was insecure and outdated, and Flash as a whole would pretty quickly end up phased out, with this all being the main motivating factor for why the web would transition to HTML5. Of course, these examples are all from the Steve Jobs era, and I don't think that's a coincidence, but Apple still does do some really good stuff even today. Here's a good example. For the most part, with maybe a few exceptions, they've been really strong on user privacy and certainly far better than Microsoft or, heaven forbid, Google. Apple's even fought the US government multiple times to avoid implementing backdoors or unlocking iPhones for suspected criminals. There's no doubt plenty more examples of Apple's stubbornness, many of which are annoying and, of course, a handful actually positive. I think the main point of concern for me these days is how Apple tends to make decisions that may not even be that bad or crazy in the moment, but then just leave their products to rot for far too long and don't give them proper upgrades nor reduce the price to reflect their current value. There's a lot of examples of this. An easy, more recent one is how Apple did an AirPods Max refresh by changing nothing except giving a few extra colors and USB-C and keeping the price the same. These headphones are now 4 years old and are missing tech from even their non-Pro AirPods, like the newer chips inside. Yet AirPods Max are presented as their highest end option. It's just dumb. The third generation iPhone SE came out in 2022 at $430 and is still being sold nearly 3 years later at the same price point, despite having most of its hardware straight up ripped from the iPhone 8, which came out in 2017. The camera sensor here is 7 years old, and the phone, even with the specs of the iPhone 13, is worth nowhere near the price Apple is charging. And the solution to this, well, Apple could lower prices to reflect the actual value of the phone, but no, they'll just make a new iPhone SE generation and replace it outright, screwing over anybody who's buying this phone anytime right up until the new device launches. And Apple's historically been really bad with leaving their Macs to rot especially. These might actually be the most common instances of Apple's stubbornness basically killing a product over time. The 2013 trash can Mac Pro is likely the most infamous example. It came out with this pretty cool but weird design, promising to be a new era of pro-level Mac computers. And then it was untouched with no upgrades for 6 years, being still purchasable for thousands of dollars in 2019. It's incredulous that Apple can just get away with stuff like that, but they can because, who's gonna stop them? The best we can do is not give them our money towards products that aren't worth our money, but Apple is such a trusted and well-regarded brand that there will always be customers spending way too much money on products that aren't worth it because they don't know any better. Do you remember HomePod? This is a confusing one. Dedicated smart speakers like Amazon Echoes and Google Homes really ramped up in popularity in the mid to late 2010s, to the point that according to NPR, as recent as 2022, 35% of adult Americans owned a smart speaker. So naturally, Apple had to cash in on this, despite the fact that Siri was pretty awful at the time, and as a result, we saw the HomePod be announced in 2017 and released in 2018. And hey, as far as smart speakers went, it was solid enough. Good sound quality, really nice design, maybe a little lacking in third-party support, and it was pricey, but not a bad product. But then it just didn't really sell that well, and only just over a year after launch, Apple slashed the price from $350 to $300 which is something they basically never do, especially that quickly. And then the device was just left to rot, barely selling, to the point that in 2021, Apple was allegedly still selling the original stock that was manufactured for the launch of HomePod 3 years earlier. We did see the HomePod Mini in 2020, which they probably should have made to begin with, as it costs a much more reasonable $100, and this is still being sold completely unchanged 4 years later, by the way, aside from some different color options on occasion, but at $100 it's cheap enough where I'm not going to complain too much, especially compared to AirPods Max or something. But what made this whole scenario so strange is that the original HomePod was discontinued in 2021, but the HomePod Mini was still being sold. So is it really a mini HomePod if no larger option exists? In 2023, we finally saw a HomePod 2, but there was like 2 years where the Mini existed, and that was it. Very strange, but I guess I prefer that over Apple still selling the first HomePod, which was quite underpowered, and in 2024 was actually labeled as a vintage Apple product. Yeah, strange all around, but I don't want to take too much time with just HomePod of all things. Probably the most irrelevant product Apple has ever sold, if we're being honest. Certainly far less relevant than something like iPod socks, you remember those? And so with that, I think we're about coming to the conclusion of this video. And what have we learned today? Why is Apple so consistently stubborn? They do a lot of things right in both software and hardware, and generally speaking, they produce really strong, often pricey, but ultimately reliable and premium devices, whether it be Mac, iPhone, iPad, or anything in between. But there is that side of them where they just refuse to do the obvious move that oftentimes would probably result in more money for them. Why is Apple this way? Well, I think they've just always been this way. Even under Steve Jobs, Apple did a lot of positive stubborn things, but there were plenty of negative examples too. Products that flopped or were never a good idea, like the hockey puck mouse for the iMac. Apple has always been this way, and I think it's because their mentality has always been that of a company who considers themselves an industry leader, is very aware of the impact they have on the market, and today is also cognizant of the fact that they're sort of too big to fail. Of course, they haven't always been like that, and particularly in the Steve Jobs era of old, Apple was in a much more precarious position. And I think that's what made Steve Jobs as an innovator and businessman so unique. No matter what, he always thought he was right. And while that's not necessarily an uncommon trait for someone in a leadership role, the difference is he usually was right. And he had this uncanny ability to make something new or even outlandish that on paper looked like a horrible idea, that a corporation would never want to do because it would upset the shareholders. Removing floppy drives, that's something that makes the computer technically less functional and capable than any PC competitor in 1998. On paper, it was a dumb move for a company that was already severely struggling and teetering on the edge of dissolution. Why would you further ostracize the market of the time by removing features? But Jobs wasn't going for the computer market of 1998. He was aiming for a new market altogether, your everyday consumer and user who would buy these iMacs and put them in their homes because they were simpler, easier to understand, and actually cool. And yeah, there were missteps like that hockey puck mouse that is so uncomfortable to actually use, or many mice from the Steve Jobs days when they had a single button which were just flat out inconvenient and felt like maybe even underestimating the consumer base for these products, like they were incapable of understanding a scroll wheel or a right click. But these were minute details, things that didn't really make much difference in the end. Apple in the 2020s is able to do whatever they want. They do have a reputation to uphold and sometimes government regulation to abide by, but they're basically a monopoly at this point, particularly when it comes to iPhone. They've locked their users into an ecosystem, and we all sort of accept it because that ecosystem is in fact really good and convenient. And even if iPhones are expensive, they're easy and solid and reliable. Apple doesn't need to be bold anymore, and so we've seen this sort of interesting dynamic where Apple's retained some of the stubborn nature that was bred into the company under Steve Jobs, a man who was notoriously difficult to work with and almost never listened to his underlings when it came to any sort of design choice or hardware decision. him. He demanded the impossible, and somehow he often got it. He brought out the best from his engineers who were actually able to stomach working with them. And while Tim Cook has fostered a much more collaborative environment, I don't think Apple will ever be able to fully separate themselves from the stubborn mindset that made them so popular and so rich to begin with. And why would they? Yeah, they make mistakes all the time. They do stuff that drives us all insane, like the headphone jack removal. But we're gonna keep buying their products, and they will keep innovating, even if it's sometimes in the form of overpriced augmented reality headsets that nobody purchases, or in an iPhone that looks practically identical to the previous 3 to 4 models. Apple is still stubborn, and always will be, because that, I believe, is one of the driving factors that has made this company and this universally recognized logo as successful and widespread as they are today. While they may not have the almost seemingly clairvoyant leadership of Jobs anymore, Tim Cook has done a really great job of keeping Apple going and forming them into the absolute behemoth they are today. Apple is stubborn, because if they weren't, they would no longer be Apple.
The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? One of the things I've always found is you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that? And I think that's the right path to take.
And that's all I've got for today. Agree with me, disagree with me, any more examples of Apple being stubborn for no reason, make sure you leave a comment down below. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button, and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We do have a Discord server, great community over there if you want to come by and say hi, and huge shout out to the channel members. Thank you guys so much for your support. And thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.